My name is Jason Matheson. I'm an investment banker with Paradigm Capital. I've been doing investment banking for about 12 years, working with growth stage companies. It is my great pleasure to be acting as host and moderator for the first part of a very exciting two-part panel. So stick around for the second part because it will be equally exciting. And the title of the panel is Tomorrow's Cannabis Technology, Empowering Global Brands. So the focus of our conversations today are going to be with, starting off with a couple of brand experts, as well as the second part is going to be more focused on some of the technologies that are helping to empower those brands and bring them to a global market. So first off, the panelists today for part one are Jose Hidalgo, Chairman and CEO of Cansortium Holdings, and Peter Miller, Co-founder and CEO of SLANG Worldwide. Cansortium Holdings is a vertically integrated cannabis company which operates under the brand Knox Medical. They are a leading provider of high-quality medical cannabis in highly regulated jurisdictions, and they're currently operating in Florida, Texas, Puerto Rico, Pennsylvania, and are expanding into Canada and South America. SLANG Worldwide is an industry leader in branded cannabis consumer packaged goods, with their products being sold in 10 U.S. states in over 2,600 stores and available on 5 continents. SLANG also just went public and started trading yesterday under the ticker SLNG. So please welcome to the stage Jose Hidalgo and Peter Miller.
Thanks, Jason.
Excellent. Okay. Gentlemen, thank you for attending today. We really appreciate it. As we talked about, the title of today's panel is really focusing on brands. Now, Jose, Cansortium is doing business as Knox Medical, focused on the medical market, and Peter, your brands are more focused on the recreational market. Jose, I'll start with you. What, in your opinion, do you think makes a good cannabis brand? Obviously focusing more on the medical side, but what do you think resonates and what do you think creates a good cannabis brand?
Well, thanks for having me today. Good to meet Peter. Well, I think what makes a great cannabis brand is what makes any great brand. I don't think it has anything to do with whether it's cannabis or any other industry. And great brands, historically, what they have done is they unleash the power back to the people. If you look at what Apple did, Apple unleashed the power of computing. If you look at what Google did, unleashed the power of information, and Uber, the power of transportation, right? And I think that cannabis is no different than that. And in order to do that, there also has to be an honesty in the process, and there has to be some ethical fabric that holds the brand together for the core values in order to really resonate with people. But whether it's recreational, whether it's medical, I think that it's pretty much, in my opinion, the same core beliefs for both.
Great. And Peter?
Yeah, I agree with everything Jose said, but I would also add that a brand is important. It's important to have a brand in a lot of places. Availability and familiarity is important, as well as trust. And trust comes from a combination of consistency plus time. And a lot of people can achieve consistency by investing in their supply chains, but you can't buy time. And so what we've been really focused on is opening these markets for availability, continuing to deliver consistent products, and then over the long term, creating brand value that way.
Now, you both brought up a good point, sort of consistency. How important is, having a consistent product when trying to develop a brand?
Yeah, it's incredibly important. We like to joke that if you're, whether you're in Portland, Oregon, or Portland, Maine, or Portland, Jamaica, you can find one of our brands and it'll be exactly the same. It's easier for us to do that since we're doing mostly oil-based products, vaporizers and edibles, than it would be for bud, but it's incredibly important. If you had a can of Coke and it was drastically different across the US, or worse, an alcohol product, and it was either 20% alcohol or 5% alcohol, and you couldn't tell by looking or smelling, then obviously you wouldn't trust that brand and you'd never go back for more.
Well, I agree, but also I think a brand I think consistency is important, but we also need to understand that cannabis, there's a consistency to it, but it's also a lot like wine. So it's going to depend on what regions it is grown. And like Peter was saying, we also do extracted products. So, but the consistency is important, but also what type we do a whole plant profile, full spectrum cannabis medications. So obviously from region to region, whether it's in the United States or South America or Australia or Europe, the strains that will do better in those environments are going to be the ones that are going to be using the formulations. But then once you achieve that kind of strain that is going to do well in those regions, then obviously it is important that the consistency, and that's one of our core beliefs, that we control the whole process from cultivation to basically shelf to the dispensaries, because we know that not just the consistency of the product is important, but the consumer experience is also important when they come, not just how they feel with your brand, but then are they going to interact in their environment that they're in. So it's quite the endeavor.
So talking about, obviously again, and the consistency of product, what are some of the challenges that you guys face in your businesses? Because it's very different. It's not like, Coke or Pepsi, where you can set up a centralized, bottling plant and distribute it throughout the world. You're in very disconnected jurisdictions. So how do you address the challenge of creating a consistent product in order to, create that brand loyalty and that consistent consumer experience?
Yep. So we operate mostly in the United States, and as you know, that is tricky because you have a federal framework and you have a state-by-state framework, and effectively THC cannot cross state lines, period. That's one of the most important pieces of guidance the federal government has given. So in order to make sure that you have consistency, your state-by-state supply chains have to follow exactly the same standard operating procedures. But since our IP travels, and in some cases even our equipment has traveled, we're able to centralize certain things. So all of our packaging and our hardware gets manufactured wherever is cheapest. We do some level of pre-assembly, and our core business could be thought of, as you mentioned, like a Coke or a Pepsi, where we provide packaging, we provide SOPs, and in a state-by-state level, we'll have fillers. And that takes time. That's not easy. We have that infrastructure in 10 states, and that's allowed us to open up 2,600 doors with these products. And our model is relatively asset light because we're not cultivating and we're not retailing. Cultivation's a little bit tricky generally, and it's best done, I think, by more mom and pop farmers, as it is in the real world, non-cannabis world. And in retail, we're just not trying to compete with our customers because we're wholesalers of finished goods to retail. So it's definitely hard doing the state-by-state supply chain thing. That's definitely something you can't do overnight. And we're lucky that we have a pretty efficient way to centralize a lot of the activities.
Well, for us, we are vertically integrated. So every place that we're operating, we are going to do all the functions: cultivating, manufacturing, distributing, dispensing, formulating, testing. So our consistency across jurisdictions is pretty even keel. The vast majority of our medicines are available in all of our jurisdictions. And our consistency in formulations varies less than 1%. That meet or exceeds pharmaceutical standards. And that's unique in the cannabis industries, where most companies do blends and they treat all THC as THC and all CBD as CBD, and they blend. We believe in the whole plant profile and the full spectrum to attain the entourage effect, and that is been received very well with the patients that we serve in all of the jurisdictions that we work at. I think that there is a very unique patient population that are relying in these medicines to deal with whether they have some serious conditions or whether they have some less serious conditions, but they still relying on the medication. So it is very, very important that they feel that every single time they come, even though the medication is manufactured from a living organism, a plant, that the effects are going to be the same over time, particularly when you're dealing with the most serious conditions.
Great. So both your companies operate in sort of different segments of the cannabis industry, one more focused on medical, one more focused on recreational. So, Peter, I'll start with you, I guess. when you're developing your brands and developing your products, what do you see as some of the differences or similarities between attracting a more recreational user versus a medical user? Some of the states do have both, but do you adopt a different approach to branding for recreational product versus medical, and what do you see as some of the differences or similarities?
Yeah, so most of our products are available in the easier to engage with medical markets and all of the recreational markets. So when I say easier to engage with, in New York, you have to renew your prescription, I believe, monthly. There's only a few conditions that qualify. So medical cannabis is really medical cannabis in terms of access. In the Southwest, it's more of a cures what ails you situation. Where you can rather easily get a prescription. And in a lot of the states where we sell in both medical and recreational environments, it can sometimes be the same store at different cash registers. In one place, you're paying, maybe 20% less tax because it's medical. So a lot of our products will just appear exactly the same with a different compliance label. And so we haven't taken an incredibly medical-focused approach, largely because we see such a massive opportunity in the recreational market, but also because that's not our skill set. Like, I'm not going to go tell AstraZeneca anything new, and nor is my team. We're mostly from tech and marketing and sales organizations, where we're applying kind of mainstream strategies to create brand value and get our products on as many shelves as possible. But that's not to disrespect or say there's not some incredibly exciting medical applications for cannabis. And there's some people doing some really exciting stuff. And the technology trickles down the same way that military technology trickles down to civilian technology, whether that's the internet or any other breakthroughs. We'll use certain technologies in our recreational products, some very basic, like the blister pack on our edibles. So our gummies, instead of being all in one vitamin-looking container, are in a pack where each one gets popped out like a Tylenol, which is important for dose control, because whether you're medical or recreational, you want to know how much you're putting in your body. And with our pack, it's 10 milligrams. With a container, if the humidity and temperature changes and they all blend into each other, you might have taken 10 milligrams. You might also be hanging onto your bed for 10 hours, taping up all the cameras on your devices and freaking out for the rest of the day, which is a terrible experience, and no one's coming back to buy our product if that's the case. So, we're definitely recreationally focused. We do sell in medical markets. They're typically the more freely accessible medical markets, and on the technology side, there's certainly things we take from medical and apply it to rec.
We have a little bit of a disagreement here in that I think the most important thing about a brand is being honest with the consumer. So if you're medical, you're medical.
We only lie to consumers.
I think no. But I mean that I'm going to tell you the example in Florida, for example. Like, Florida is a medical market where we're headquartered, right? And so there are companies that are medical, but they're not really medical. They're really recreational companies. And that game may be won right now with the consumer, but the consumer can see right through it. So either you're going to be a medical brand and you're going to be medically focused, and that's what you're going to do, and you're going to invest in research and development, in clinical studies, clinical efficacy studies. You're going to have PhDs in your staff, and you're going to really work in develop what I call the cannabinoid medicine, which I think that will be rewarded by the patients. And I think in the recreational space, I don't like calling it recreational as much as I like to call it is wellness. I think a lot of the there's obviously a small part of the population that are the diehard stoners. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I like to have fun just as the next guy does. But I think a lot of the people that are using cannabis recreational, they're using it for wellness purposes. They have anxiety, to what Peter was saying. They're in a market that is more accessible. And I think that's one of the areas that the markets in the West Coast are ahead of what the markets in the East Coast are. That if you have anxiety, if you have pain, if you have issues sleeping, if you're dealing with some of the more benign conditions, I think you should be able to go and access these products that are going to be highly beneficial for you. So for me, it's the whole approach to treat to wellness. I do think that some of the formulations for the most serious conditions require a lot of attention, require a lot of study, and that's what's going to ultimately be rewarded in the marketplace. But then I think, like I said, there's a place for the wellness, whether we call it adult use. I'm not so keen on the recreational space because I don't think we talk about alcohol like you're drinking alcohol recreationally. You just drink alcohol, So, but I do think that there's a place for both, and I think that long term. In terms of what the future value of the developments for drugs in the medical space, using the cannabinoids as the basis of the formulations are going to prove to be a breakthrough in medicine, and that's our core belief as a company.
Well, I think we can all agree that the cannabis market is large enough that there's going to be recreational, there's going to be medical, there's going to be subsegments, flower, concentrates, hardware, all sorts, and there's not sort of one right answer or one magic bullet or one that's going to take over all of the others.
I can tell you that I think that when you get all the way to concentrates, that's considered medical. You can still do whole plant profile, full spectrum concentrates of 91% THC, still have cannabinoids, you still have the terpenes present. Once you're dealing with wax, once you're dealing with shatter and things of that nature, that is definitely more, I would call adult use. There's very little medical applications at that point other than the 16 known conditions that THC can treat, right?
So given that, I guess, and Jose, maybe I'll start with you. Are there, technologies or processes that you're using or that you're developing that helps you attract your medical patients, your core focus of patients? And Peter, the same question to you afterwards, but I mean, are there technologies that you guys are developing to help you tap in and hone your brand and create a consistent product and a consistent consumer experience and grow your market?
Yeah, I like to start by saying that the consumers are in great part the victims of this whole industry because we have done a very poor job, and I'm talking about as an industry, in educating them as to what is what and what works for what. I was having dinner with Jason last night, and the waitress told us that basically every time she would come, she would say, oh, CBD works for everything, right? So there's a little bit of that going on. As far as the technology we've developed proprietary machinery to speed in the drying process to capture the whole plant profile, the terpene profile. And for a company like ours is much more complex for the supply chain, like Peter was saying, because we're not blending strains. So if we're growing one of our strains, whether it's a Baldor or whether it's a high CBD like a Perla, one of our proprietary strains, we're never going to mix that with a similar strain because we do believe in the full spectrum. And in fact, Dr. Stacy Gruber from Harvard, who is a 25 leading researcher in recreational use or adult use, or however we want to say it, she believes that the real future for medical cannabis is into providing the whole plant profile, full spectrum. So we go to great lengths to make sure that we have enough, that we have the plan done in the supply chain. We also have because we're fortunate enough that we have our own dispensary, so we get retrofitted information for our patients as to what's working with them. We conduct some small clinical studies that we've done with some pockets of patients, and we're distributed geographically all over the United States as well. So we can do a big data collection and kind of retrofit back into our cultivation and manufacturing and understand that, for example, patients are liking more to use drops that they like to use cartridges of indica THC, for example. And then you start kind of like understanding how you can provide the formulations in a way that is going to be more effective when treating these conditions. But yeah, and the technology development is an ongoing. We're developing other technology extraction. Right now we're using CO2, which is the purest of extraction. But we're looking at other ways that we can still retain the cannabinoid profile and get more efficiency as well.
Yeah, we use a lot of technology, and again, a lot of it trickles down from other industries. A lot of the CO2 extraction technology that Jose and we also use has application to the flavoring industries and decaffeinating coffee. So we also use CO2. And in terms of full spectrum, multi-batch, since we're addressing a consumer market, and vape and concentrates are such a large category, second after bud and before edibles, we've segmented it a few ways. Some people want and are willing to pay, more importantly, for a really premium product, single batch, full spectrum, and we'll extract it twice. And without geeking out too much on the technology, we'll do a subcritical CO2 extraction to pull terpenes, Then we'll decarboxylate the product and run it again at a supercritical CO2 level to pull cannabinoids, and then we'll reintroduce the two results from the same batch of cannabis, and you get a really high-end, full-spectrum taste. But that could go for $80 for a half-gram cartridge, and that's a lot. And like most people in society generally, most consumers aren't looking to pay for the most expensive products. We also have a distillate product that's quite inexpensive, and we'll take multiple batches. We'll just run it one time, optimizing best we can for terpenes and cannabinoids, and that'll be in our baked brand, and that does incredibly well. And then you have the specialty category where people will want things like flavor, and in sort of a jewel culture, it's turned out that that's an incredibly popular product, even though it wouldn't be my preference to vape the Rocket Pop or Lemon Meringue cannabis vaporizer, but it's incredibly popular. So we let data guide what we're doing. The technology for all these different products varies. Most of it's been borrowed from other industry. There's some interesting things happening as the industry scales. So the first few 20-liter vessels we bought a few years ago could produce a certain amount, but now we're starting to see demand for much more, and that's where cannabis companies are starting to have to innovate a little bit to achieve scale that hasn't been required before. So there's a lot of cool technology in the supply chain, but ultimately the end user, our end user, is most interested in a good product that fits sort of the profile of what they want, both price and quality and flavor-wise. And we provide a lot of different products to a lot of different segments of primarily the vape and the edibles categories.
Right. So what do you think is, the biggest hurdle in expanding cannabis into new jurisdictions and taking your brands on a global scale? Because, when I say new jurisdictions, I'm thinking, sort of outside of North America. Obviously, U.S. states are governed state by state. In Canada, we have REC. New South American markets, new European markets, overseas, Asia. What do you see as the biggest hurdle to tapping into those global markets to really take your brands to a global level?
I'll just quickly speak about how we expanded across North America and talk a little bit about what we're seeing in Europe in terms of trends. And Jose will probably have a lot more to say about South America than I will. But in terms of the US, we were able to grow and be in as many places as we were by leveraging partnership. So it's really important for us to work with other groups. We're not trying to do everything ourselves, not only because we aren't good at doing everything ourselves, but also it doesn't scale as quickly if you're just trying to get a consumer brand out there. So in each state, initially, we used a partnership at some level of the supply chain, and in some cases we acquired, in some cases we earned equity through the relationship, and that allowed us to get to a lot of places. I think we'll be using partnerships to get into Europe as well. And in terms of consumer trends, there's some really interesting stuff happening on CBD in Europe. They're calling it Cannabis Light. And if you go to Italy, there's over 1,000 stores that sell what look like pre-rolled joints, bud in a jar. Like, it straight up just looks like cannabis, smells like cannabis, and people are smoking it in the streets, and you're like, this can't be legal. But it's CBD. And that really helps destigmatize and make people comfortable with that, what they're smelling, what they're seeing, and there's a good chance that if they see someone on a patio or outside their office and it smells like cannabis, hey, maybe that's just CBD, and I'm not going to judge that guy, and maybe he's not, whatever negative ideas people have about cannabis consumers. So the destigmatization is super important. The regulatory stuff, as companies, we can only do so much about. We'll sponsor efforts, and we're not at the front end of advocacy, although I appreciate that there's a lot of people who are. But once the regulation is friendly to our industry, and we're able to enter markets through partners, we will. And if you look at kind of the Western world, people report cannabis use differently, but we're starting to see that they use cannabis pretty similarly per capita, with some differences, but not material differences. So even in the U.S., I bet if you tested the sewers of Oklahoma and the sewers of Vermont, on a per capita basis, there'd be similar amounts of THC. It's just kind of in the shadows in some places just because of cultural sort of stigma and history. So I expect the same thing in Western Europe especially. There's a lot of cannabis consumption. The stigma's coming down, and we'll love to be there as soon as we can with the right partners.
Well, before I talk about the my view on the international market. I think we also have to look at who are the consumers that we're addressing today, the addressable population, and who are going to be the consumers of the addressable population in the future. And I think that the days of the joints or bud or the smoking, those days are going to, as the population continues to grow and new users that had never used cannabis before, which is certainly our experience in the markets that we operate under, they rather use different methods of administration, not just because it's more discreet, it's because it's more convenient as well. So I do think that there's a place. I think we're going to have a super premium perhaps market, very kind of localized, kind of like what you see in Sonoma or Napa when people are selling wine from a certain appellation. And that's true to the flower market, because the reality is the shelf life of flower is just not the longest. So I think we have to look past the existing growth of population. We were talking in Florida last week, and we see the population in Florida patient growing from 200,000 to 1 million patients in the very near future. Well, I assure you that this addition of 800,000 people in Florida are not going to be people that have smoked pot their entire lives. So you're going to see a shift in demographic. In our case, our average patient is about 55 years old. It's a female. So you see a lot of them that are coming to our dispensaries. Now, going back to your question regarding the international legislation, we have to understand, and I always say this, and I'm in Canada, I'm not in the United States now, but I always say that the only place like the United States is the United States. Canada is our neighboring country. The world is a very conservative place. South America is an incredibly conservative, religious part of the world, and so is Europe. And so if you look at what the emerging markets, as far as I'm concerned, that's just true to cannabis, it's true to just about any industry. You're looking at Asia and you're looking at South America. So you're going to look at high barriers of entry, a lot more regulation, limited number of licenses, a lot of testing. Like, for example, for you to go into Brazil, you need Anvisa, which is the FDA of Brazil. If you're going to go to Mexico, it's the COFEPRIS. If you're going to go to Argentina, it's ANMAT, and so on. So there are a lot more significant hurdles to going into these countries, which, to Peter's point, they have a very conservative approach to cannabis. So I do think that the wave of cannabis worldwide, it is in fact indeed happening and taking place, but it's going to be in terms of a medical wave that then will become evolving, and whether that takes 2, 10, or 20 years, that remains to be seen. But there seems to be a global acceptance for medical cannabis as I see it when I travel.
Okay, and so last question for you guys. In 30 seconds or less, since this is an investor conference, if you could tell investors one thing to help them identify and invest in a successful cannabis company, what would you tell them?
Well, I'm going to shill for my own company, so I think
Please
the most important thing they should look for is as many of your branded products in as many places as possible, and with a business model that scales. And that's ultimately how I look at our business. We have, as a portfolio, separated more consumers from their money than any other portfolio of brands. We don't own the whole supply chain. So our revenue might not compare to the retail store's revenue because we're wholesaling to that store, but I believe our revenue is more scalable than a lot of other models. And ultimately, we're a model that looks to how the real world operates and try to apply that to cannabis, because cannabis is going to have to follow the rules of the real world, and consumer behaviors in other categories will be applied to cannabis. And so ultimately, I think you should look for a company that's not trying to create demand for something that there isn't one for in terms of category within cannabis. I think you want to look for someone who has the track record and who has that penetration, and ultimately whose model can scale.
Well, I think you have to, well, first of all, I think the exuberant days of cannabis are over. I think now people are going to start looking at real metrics of performance, and are these companies well run or not? And I think this is the year of performance for operators in the space. So we're looking forward to 2019 and beyond. But I think you want to look at companies that are honest into their core beliefs and what is that they're actually about trying to do. And so I think that for that, just like Peter's companies focus on the adult recreational use, we're very focused in the medical space, and to the extent that you decide to how you're going to invest in the space, you're going to have to look at what sort of IP these companies have, not just in the metrics that they have today, because it's a lot has to do with like a tech investment. You have to look at long-term, what is some of the untapped potential that these companies may or may not have. You're going to have to look a lot more under the hood. You're going to have have to look a lot more at these management teams that I think ever in the industry they did before, and look at track records and what these people have been able to do and what they tell you they're going to do, because you can no longer throw these gargantuan numbers out there without people calling people out. And so I think that the next 18 months are going to be very, very interesting in the space for sure.
Yeah. I would just quickly add to it, we've alluded to it a couple times. We are talking about somewhat different business models, but there are wild numbers that are thrown out there, and some of those numbers are really exciting, and you will have to look at operators, but something that is exciting to think about is on the medical side, the amount of money people are spending to go to sleep at night is, you probably know better than me from pharma, but it's got to be in the nine figures, in the hundreds of billions. Pain, $500 billion. Those are both massive opportunities for cannabis. But then if you look at, how much people are spending to alter their mood, to relax, and you strictly look at alcohol, that's also in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So there's a challenge to look at that massive opportunity and then look at who could actually, fulfill the potential that they're telling you that they can, and it's a wild world out there in cannabis investing, and I think that ultimately there's room for a lot of players to win.
Excellent. Gentlemen, well, thank you very much for your insights. We really do appreciate it, and good luck on global expansion and taking your brands to new markets, and very successful 2019.
Yeah, thank you, Jason.
And stick around, because we now have part 2 of our panel, so don't go anywhere. So I'd like to bring to the stage now my colleague at Paradigm Capital, Michael Freeman. Michael will be leading part 2 of our panel. Michael works with Raul Saragasser in the research department. If you guys want copies of our research reports, we can hand those out. So please welcome Michael Freeman.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Jason. Great discussion just now. So we just heard some key aspects of developing strong global brands and products from 2 CEOs of terrific cannabis companies. It seems like consistent products and stable supply chains are crucial for making a mark on a global scale. So now Paradigm is keen to present some of the technologies that are going to change the face of the cannabis industry, empowering companies like this to develop globally relevant products. So I'm now very pleased to welcome to the stage Christine Allen from Avicanna and Ben Chiarelli from Cellibre. All right, thank you very much. All right, so Christine Allen is a full professor at the University of Toronto's Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy, and her research focuses on the design and development of materials used to deliver drugs, with a special focus on nanotechnology-based drug transport. Christine is the Chief Scientific Officer of Avicanna, which is a member of Johnson & Johnson's J-Labs Accelerator environment. Avicanna is developing innovative, evidence-based cannabinoid formulations for the pharmaceutical, natural health, and dermatological markets. Christine's research has resulted in more than 130 peer-reviewed publications, numerous career awards, and has appointed her as Dean of the Faculty of Pharmacy and as President-elect of the Canadian Society for Pharmaceutical Science. All this is to say that something very special is going on at Avicanna, and they're in very good hands. Ben Chiarelli is the founder and chief executive officer of Cellibre, a next-generation biotechnology company that treats biology as a manufacturing technology, turning cells into specialized, sustainable factories for the manufacture of globally significant products at scale. Prior to joining Cellibre, Ben worked as VP Corporate Development and Strategy at Synthetic Genomics, Inc., the world's preeminent synthetic biology and bio-based product company. Synthetic genomics is also the heritage of Cellibre's world-class scientific team. Ben held a 9-year tenure on Wall Street, where he executed more than $20 billion in healthcare sector transactions on behalf of Jefferies and JP Morgan. So, Ben is bringing the science and business in a pretty serious way, so I'd like you to welcome them both. Thank you very much. All right, so I'm gonna take a microphone. Oh, right there. Excellent. Thank you very much, both of you, for being here today. Of course. Now, let's start with Christine. Cantech brings together an investor audience that has pretty diverse backgrounds. So I wonder, being cognizant of this, I wonder if you could explain the role of strong formulation science in the cannabis industry, maybe using current cannabis products like CBD oils as a waypoint for the audience.
Okay. I've obviously dedicated most of my professional life to drug delivery and formulation science, so obviously I think it's important. If you were to name any blockbuster drug that's out there, I can tell you about the great formulation science that's behind it. And so, of course, formulation science is also important in the cannabis industry. So when we're working with cannabinoids, we think of them as active pharmaceutical ingredients. And cannabinoids such as cannabidiol is susceptible to degradation. It's susceptible to oxidation. It's sensitive to light. So if you're thinking about the shelf life of your product, the stability of your product, you can use formulation science to protect cannabidiol and other cannabinoids from degradation, and that's what we're doing. As well, when you think about where you want that active pharmaceutical ingredient to go. So if you want to use a cream, you want to apply it to the skin, it's got to get through the skin. If you're taking something orally, you want it to be bioavailable. You want it to be absorbed and get into the systemic circulation. So I'll give you an example. When we first started out, we ordered just an oral oil of CBD that was available commercially, and then we made a pretty easy formulation in the lab that we also administered orally. So we're doing these studies in rats. We administer the CBD oil that we ordered to rats. We also administer our formulation orally to rats. And we measured the blood levels. And for the commercial formulation, the blood levels were almost undetectable. With our formulation, we had sustained levels for more than 4 hours and high levels. So obviously, we can then change the dose that the rat is receiving by administering less of the formulation. But the point is that formulation science allows you then to really exploit the therapeutic potential of the ingredient and also to protect against any toxicity that this agent might have. So CBD, for example, is susceptible to metabolism. Some of the metabolites can have toxicity. So also our formulations are being designed to prevent some of that metabolism and off-target effects.
All right, thanks so much, Christine. Now, Ben, could you help our diverse audience understand what cannabinoid biosynthesis is? And acknowledging this audience again, tell us why folks like this should invest in a company like Cellibre.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, the term biosynthesis, a little bit of a misnomer. Biosynthesis actually happens in every single cell on the planet. So every single cell does biosynthesis. What Cellibre does is what I like to call cellular agriculture. So using cells really as a manufacturing technology. So if you think about any cell in the world as a manufacturing facility, all those cells have machinery, and those machinery are instructed by the cell's DNA code to turn nutrients into stuff. And actually, the cannabis plant is a fascinating biological example of this. If you go to the 30,000-foot level and say, what is that cannabis plant doing? It's taking water, sunlight, and nutrients from the soil and simultaneously making over 400 chemicals, 100 plus of which are bioactive. If you ask Dow DuPont or Pfizer to do that type of manufacturing at scale, they wouldn't know what the heck to do, right? So scientifically and biologically, very interesting. But from a product development perspective, commercialization perspective, and research perspective, that beauty and complexity causes major problems. So what we do at Cellibre is we take the machinery and the DNA code from a cannabis plant to, for instance, make CBD. We would pop that into a cell like yeast and feed that yeast sugar water in a fermentation process and brew pure natural cannabinoid isolates at scale. So removing the need for agriculture completely from the supply chain for those particular molecules. And why that's important is from a research perspective, it allows us to take a look at what's called the minor cannabinoids, the non-THC and CBDs of the world, to figure out what do they do for us, good, bad, or the other, by the way. I think the bad is just as important as the good in understanding that. But it also allows you to get to consistent, scalable product in the consumer sector as you're building brands, or in pharma as you're taking things through the FDA. So the way to think about this is this technology is the same thing that was done in insulin. So if you know any diabetics in your life that take insulin, believe it or not, we used to get insulin from a pig pancreas, not scalable, until a really, really smart scientist at Eli Lilly said, oh, we can program a different cell to actually ferment the same exact natural product.
Thank you very much, Ben. And in the cellular agriculture space, there's a small field of competition right now, but there are other companies doing this. So I wonder if you could describe what makes Cellibre different.
Yeah, so most people that do this science use a couple of different cells, the most popular of which are E. coli, believe it or not, and what's called baker's yeast, or Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Those cells are really, really well understood. We have tools to manipulate them, engineer them, and reprogram them. But for cannabinoid production specifically, I like to use the analogy that that's kind of like taking a Ford F-150 factory and trying to use it to make iPhones. So what we do at Cellibre is we flip that on its head. Rather than trying to bang that square peg in a round hole, we go back into nature and say, where is there a cell that's industrializable, but set up biologically and chemically to make the product that we care about? And there's a bunch of different variables to go into that. But we use almost exclusively what is often referred to as non-traditional organisms. So organisms that are not yeast and E. coli that get us closer to the endpoint, and ultimately when we scale and when we commercialize, should provide us for better economics downstream. So I think the fundamentally different approach that we take is really being able to work in those non-traditional cell factories, if you will.
Great, and a pragmatic approach. Thank you. So, Christine, now, I wonder if you could help members of our audience decide whether a company in the cannabis space is capable of formulating effective, successful products. And what would make a company, for instance, like Avicanna, much more equipped to develop these successful products than perhaps some other companies out there? What would you look for?
Well, I would send somebody like me in. So I think it's, I'd say show me the data. I mean, so if you look at what Avicanna is doing, and some of it is done in my lab, some of it is done in their own facilities, but we've got robust science behind everything that we're doing. It's isolating the cannabinoids, characterizing them, all of the formulation work and the characterization. So we're essentially treating this as if it's the pharmaceutical industry. And it's just the robust protocols and methodologies that we're using. So I would send in somebody like myself and say, show me the data. Show me the analytical protocols. Show me your chromatograms. Show me everything. And we do that from isolation of the compounds all the way to the in vitro and in the in vivo studies. So we're doing our own animal studies as well. So every single formulation or product that we're developing, with the exception of the cosmetic line, we're not testing those on animals, but everything else is being done in a very robust way, and we look at complete pharmacokinetics, bioavailability, biodistribution, and toxicity. So.
Excellent, thank you. And given your particular focus in nanomedicine, there is, in the cannabis space, there's a surprising amount of talk of nano as a dissolution technology. So I guess I wonder if you could find or give some advice to our audience, like what could we possibly understand in a press release or reading about a company that would allow a scientist with background in this to see this as a successful tech? How we know that a nanomedicine or a nanotechnology in cannabis would be successful?
So CBD and THC are ideal for me in terms of nanotechnology, largely because we work with a lot of polymeric technologies, and these are both very hydrophobic compounds, so they're very easy to encapsulate in a lot of the nanotechnologies that we use in my lab, and we've done that. So very high loading levels. So actually, I think in many ways, it's a marrying of two really. It's a great combination, and could be very powerful in cancer. We heard somebody else talking before about cardiovascular disease and many other diseases. So it's essentially, we're using that right now to solubilize some of the cannabinoids. So it's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Now for Ben, In the cannabis space, we've been watching and waiting for these two giants to march into the industry, pharma and consumer packaged goods companies. And now I wonder if we took the political and legal constraints out of the equation, I wonder what are some major operational or technical hurdles these types of companies might face as they act on a global scale.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I think, first and foremost, I think the cannabis industry tends to underestimate how much work these companies have done. Pharma has been working on cannabinoids for probably 3 or 4 decades in places like Israel under different names, so you don't know about it. I actually sat down with one of the largest beer producers recently who told me CBD and THC are not the most interesting cannabinoids for consumer packaged goods, which I thought was fascinating. The fact that they know that already is interesting to me. I think the variables change for each one of those. So I think for pharma, they're much less worried about cost. They are much more worried about consistency and scalability. They need their products to be the exact same every single time for a specific therapeutic condition. That includes, by the way, not only the active ingredient where I am, but that's also the formulation side of the equation as well. That is really, really important to pharma. There's also animal health, which I think is the sneakiest market for cannabinoids that not enough people talk about. There's the therapeutic side of animal health, which I would put similar to human therapeutics, but there's also the consumer side of animal health. So we've talked to some of the largest pet food manufacturers in the world, and for instance, they're working on formulations for older cats and dogs with arthritic conditions and anti-inflammation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I would say for the consumer goods, both on the pet side and on the human side, cost really becomes a big, big issue on that side. But scalability and consistency is also the same. I went to the beer company. They have a facility that makes over 10 million cans of beer a day. And they need to get the same ingredient at the same concentrations into every single can of beer. So I think a lot of the technologies being developed today are very, very good for kind of the world that we live in. I think when these big guys come online, we're going to see things shift in a major Hello? Hello. Okay. Yeah. So I think we're going to see things shift from a supply chain perspective in a pretty major way, depending on the market that you're in. I think there's always going to be markets for kind of the way it's done now, but when we start talking about things like patches and et cetera, all the product innovation, I think the supply chain constraints are going to get pretty heavy from an agricultural source.
Absolutely, and I think it's implied, but I wonder what the role of cellular agriculture and Cellibre in both of those spaces could be.
Yeah, so I think ultimately we provide, especially for the minor cannabinoids in pharmaceuticals and animal health, I think we just provide a better, more consistent solution. I think it's going to be really hard to do plant genetics and plant biology to get those minor cannabinoids at scale, especially when you're talking about Pfizer scale, not some smaller company. In the consumer packaged goods space, I would say it depends, right? Cellular agriculture, there's this movement for organic and source of your material is very important for human packaged goods. At the same time, there's a lot of people in my country, the United States, that drink Bud Light and eat Twinkies. So I think it's going to depend on the product and the market that you're going after ultimately. But I think having a bunch of different options, whether it be plant-derived, cell culture-derived, cellular ag-derived, I think it's going to be important and it's going to be very market-dependent.
Great, thanks a bunch. And Christine, I wonder if we could have your perspectives on how formulation science could affect these companies, pharmaceutical and consumer packaged goods, as they enter the space.
I agree with many of the comments you made. I think the pharmaceutical industry, they've been working on drug development for how many years? So I think there's a lot of knowledge and expertise that we can leverage to really apply to the cannabis industry. I think a little bit of, I think there are people that are out there that are underestimating the science that is needed in this field. I think there are products that are on the market that consumers or patients are using and they aren't delivering. And I think we have an ethical responsibility to deliver, to bring good science to this field. And I think pharmaceutical scientists, people like myself, I actually say to my students, Big Pharma, R&D and Big Pharma left Canada 10 years ago. So we've got all these students that are graduating pharmaceutical sciences degrees, and they can't find employment in large pharmaceutical companies in Canada. But they are perfectly poised for this industry. because all of their skills and knowledge are needed. So I think this industry should have the same high standards that the pharmaceutical industry has in terms of product development.
I could not agree more. Thank you. So I'm gonna ask a series of questions that apply to both of you. And the first of these is, what are some popular misconceptions about each of your fields of work? What are people saying that you're just finding are incorrect?
Sure. Yours is easy. Okay. I get almost hilarious emails. People will email me and they'll say they've got this really great compound and it's shown great activity in cell culture, and can I just stick it into an animal for them? So they don't quite understand that something that looks great in a test tube or in cell culture, there's actually science involved in taking it from the cell culture, from the test tube, into the animal. So if it's we've got to do these pre-formulation studies, right? We've got to look to see, is it soluble, is it stable? And then we can fix those issues with our drug delivery technology, and so that we can administer it safely to an animal. So I think a lot of people forget about formulation science and drug delivery, and you see drugs being recalled. I can give you examples of drugs that have been recalled, blockbuster drugs that have been recalled because people didn't do the necessary pre-formulation and formulation studies that need to be done to ensure that they're safe. So.
Absolutely. So, on that, there is a significant gap between any preclinical work that's done in any field, let alone cannabinoid science, and what happens in the clinic. So, when a company or a laboratory comes out with preclinical data, we must recognize the power of that data and the generalizability. So, yes, excellent point, Ben.
Yeah, so mine's a little bit twofold. Number one, the first thing I get is, so you're making synthetic cannabinoids, and I have a seizure and then take some CBD. We are not making synthetic cannabinoids. We are making the exact same natural product that comes from the plant. The way to think about it, remember, cells are manufacturing facilities, same natural product, different cell factory. Instead of doing a slow growth plant cell, we're using faster cells that grow faster and produce more of the product of interest. The other one we get is GMO, and I find the GMO conversation fascinating. I won't get into my general feelings broadly, but GMO CBD doesn't have DNA. So having a genetically modified CBD I don't think exists. It's a chemical. So what we are genetically modifying is the factory that makes it. So CBD that you get from a plant or CBD that you get from our process, by definition, isn't genetically modified unless you have some DNA in there somewhere. I would also argue that every single cannabis plant and every single human being in this room has been genetically modified at some point, but that's for another day. But I think those are the two big misconceptions with what we do for a living.
Thank you very much. And you touched on something that's been a curiosity of mine and a curiosity of many people who call our office, because we're the cannabis science guys. I'm wondering if you could describe the difference between cannabinoids that come from a cellular agriculture process versus those that come from a chemical synthetic process. Not necessarily looking at their chemical properties, supposing they come out the same. Just wondering what the applications of these two technologies in the industry could be.
Yeah, so they both work. They both work really well. There's a company here in Canada called InMed that uses kind of a bioindustrial approach. There's another one called Tiwanaut out of Florida. There are also people using purely chemical processes to make the same exact natural product. Now, those aren't the same as, for instance, Marinol, which is a synthetic THC marketed by AbbVie, or Insys therapeutic. Those are THC analogs that are not the same natural product molecule. But if you're talking about just the InMeds of the world and what we're doing, I think they're largely the same, and I think they'll largely work. I think where the difference comes in is when you start scaling these technologies, the larger your scale gets, the more important your input costs become on your economic model. So the larger your scale, the more percentage of your total COGS is your inputs. With us, our input is sugar water and potentially, quite frankly, some waste materials. For those other processes, the input is expensive chemicals and potentially some stuff from cells. So I think you're at I will call it a margin disadvantage, not a cost disadvantage, because I would never ruin a market. But I think you're a bit disadvantaged there. Also, this chemical processes, fundamentally, each one of them is likely to have a different manufacturing process with different inputs and potentially different equipment. Regardless of the cannabinoid that we are making, it is cell, sugar water, fermentation, downstream processing. So we're pretty consistent as we scale the production of these different cannabinoids. So those are the two differences I would say.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Now, if you could pick one big thing to change in today's cannabis industry, what would it be and why?
Me? Okay.
If you like.
Honestly, I'm a little disappointed that there are so many products that are out there. I mean, just cannabis oils. People are using CBD oil and so on, and I think there's a lack of science behind it. I think there's a lack of. I think the regulatory framework around it needs to be tightened up a little bit. So I'm really proud, actually, of the work that we're doing, because I think we are bringing good science to the space and evidence. Evidence behind all of the clinical applications that we're pursuing. We're going to have very strong preclinical evidence to pursue those streams. So I think I'm just a little disappointed in the science right now, and hoping that it can catch up to the hype and the enthusiasm that the consumers and patient advocacy groups have, because I think we owe that to them.
Absolutely. And Ben?
Yeah, I completely concur with that. I think one of the at least in the U.S., it's probably a little bit better up here in Canada, although we're based in San Diego, so I try not to come up here during polar vortexes as much as I can. In the U.S., the industry right now reminds me a lot of the tonic industry in the early 1900s. A lot of claims around what things do with not a lot of evidence to back it up. The industry is going to kick themselves into perpetuity if they continue down that path. I'd like to see people doing more of the science, but also don't make claims until you have that data. I think that's really important, not only for your brand, but for patient safety down the road. I mean, you don't want people doing things that could potentially harm them down the road. I would encourage anybody in the sector to go read what the FDA wrote when they did the descheduling of FDA-approved therapeutic from GW Pharma for CBD. If you were to make those claims in the U.S. when these regulations flip, the FDA will shut you down in short order. So I think the industry has a lot of maturing to do around that specific area.
Absolutely. I concur. Now, both the technologies that Avicanna and Cellibre are leveraging are super compelling and will each make a major impact on the future of cannabis. An unfair question to you now. Which of these technologies will do more to accelerate the future of cannabis? A competitive question, maybe. Or a collaborative question, if you like.
I mean, you can... Our products that we make, our API, actually doesn't matter unless we have what Christine and her team do, period. So what we make actually is irrelevant unless you're doing the formulations properly. I would argue that the formulations will be fine whether or not we exist or not, because you can still do formulations around the natural product. Most people in the industry probably wouldn't know that little nuance or understand it or even care about it, but I will sit up here as a guy that's out raising money for his company right now and say that she's more important.
Very kind.
Very kind.
No, I'd say they're complementary, right? We need each other, so they're complementary. Our proprietary formulations would love to use your cannabinoids. So,
absolutely. Thank you very much for that. And to each of you, is there anything that we left out of today's conversation that should be said to this very kind investor audience?
I think we have a real opportunity in this industry. So I think I was impressed with the panel before. I think you've brought in a lot of good companies here, a lot of good science that people are trying to do. And I think this is for the sake of patients out there, consumers out there. We have a responsibility to do good research, to develop evidence-based or evidence-backed products. And otherwise, I think we could really kill the industry. You just have one or two products that get on the market that cause problems, and the industry will go backwards quite quickly.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. This is the nerdy scientist and the folks up here, to say something a little bit controversial and have my bankers give me dirty looks. Cannabis isn't medicine. What is medicine is these cannabinoids, and I think we need to take a deep, deep look at understanding them. The reason I ended up in this industry actually is because I worked for the largest clinical toxicology and pharmacogenetics lab in the United States, and I've actually been to places like Tennessee and West Virginia and seen what's happening with painkillers in our country, and I think you guys have very similar issues up here, but not to the same scale. There are molecules in this plant that help right? I met with a guy whose daughter, he was just to the right of Attila the Hun conservative, and his daughter had seizures. And for years, he would not put her on cannabis or cannabis extracts, and finally he did. He looked me in the face and said, I wasted 2 years of my daughter's life. Those are the types of anecdotal stories that make you realize there's power here, but you have to do it the right way, and you have to have science that's backing up what claims you're making. So,
I love that. Thank you very much. And we have been officially beeped at. So I'd like to thank my panelists, and I'd like to thank you for listening today.
thank you, sir. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.